Have you ever heard of a widow who raised a baby Bigfoot and was later saved by an entire tribe of forest giants? Sounds insane, right? But this story, set deep in the Ouachita woods in 1991, is anything but fiction. The truth is, Bigfoot may not just be a wild creature. They communicate, observe rituals, and, most shocking of all, they repay kindness. They left crescent-shaped rock circles, grass-braided gifts, and a piece of blue fabric from a half-finished quilt. This wasn't random. It was sacred. According to dozens of local witness reports and First Nations legends that match perfectly with the signs found, this goes beyond myth. It's a pattern. In this video, you'll learn how one act of compassion forged a living pact between human and forest beings, the subtle signs that you're being watched from the woods, and why 3 knocks at night may be more than just coincidence. June Carver, 64, lived alone at the forest's edge. One winter night, she found a freezing infant Bigfoot and took it in. Days later, the matriarch and her tribe appeared, not to attack, but to bow. When wildfires threatened June's land, they returned, silently holding the fire line. The footprints, fire scars, and cedar-bound offerings are all real. So, if you've ever heard a knock in the night, don't ignore it. They might be waiting for you to knock back. Autumn had arrived without permission. The wind shifted that evening like something lost had come home. It carried with it the smell of cold pine, rusted hinges, and the slow decay of fallen leaves. The wooden wind chime hanging from the porch beam clinked now and then, soft and offbeat, like a memory trying to find its rhythm again. June Carver stood by the kitchen window. A needle paused in midair. Her hands were steady, but her breath had stilled. It was nearly 10. The goats should have settled, the chickens too. But something, no, not something, some sound had reached through the walls. Not a scream, not a growl, not the yip of a fox or the long hunger of a coyote. This was thinner, like a thread being pulled too tight. Like a whimper too small to be heard by anyone but someone who'd once listened for a baby's first cry and never heard it. She took the lantern from its hook, struck the match with a practiced flick, and stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath her boots. Cold air climbed her sleeves. Off to the left, where the chicken wire curved along the edge of the goat pen, something shifted, rustled, like wet fur dragging through pine needles. June moved slow, the way you do when your bones remember the time they broke. She didn't call out, didn't ask who was there. She'd learned long ago that some things don't speak in the ways we understand. At the fence line, caught in the lantern's spill, was a shape that did not run, small, hunched. Matted fur clung to it like tangled weeds. The skin underneath was too tight over the bones. Legs drawn up like it had tried to fold itself smaller than the cold could find. Water dripped from its hair, if you could call that tangled mop hair. But it wasn't the body that stopped her breath. It was the eyes. Huge, glassy black, but not empty, reflecting the light back like stars in a creek. Watching her, her grip on the lantern tightened. Her heart beat once, hard. Then memory struck her from beneath. Like a wave she didn't see coming. The hospital room. The still silence. The blue blanket that never got used. The name that never left her lips. She should have turned around. She could have called Hobart. He'd have come with that rifle of his and put the whole thing to rest. But she didn't. Because deep inside her, stitched somewhere between the bones and the sorrow, lived a rule she had never spoken aloud. Always leave a warm bowl out for the lost ones. June knelt slowly. The creature flinched. Its fingers, too long, too knuckled, clutched the wire as if pain might anchor it to the world. She whispered nothing, only lowered the lantern so the light wouldn't blind it. Then, quietly, she took off her shawl and laid it across her arms like a cradle. It didn't fight, just sagged into her touch, breath coming ragged and hot against her collarbone. Its skin, beneath the wet coat, was warm, almost fevered, and too light. too light for something alive. Inside the barn, she cleared the corner stall, layered fresh hay, and wrapped it in one of the goat blankets. She didn't know why, but the blue one seemed wrong, so she chose the tan wool one instead. The creature curled up, limbs tucked in, as if it had done this before. Somewhere else, with someone who didn't make it. June warmed goat milk on the stove, crumbled cornbread into a bowl beside it. She sat cross-legged near the stall door and placed the food gently beside the bundle of fur. For a while, nothing moved. The wind scratched at the walls. One of the hens let out a restless squawk. Then the creature stirred. One hand, no, paw, reached, trembling, and pulled the bread close. No snatching, no tearing, just small bites, like it had learned not to waste anything. She didn't speak. Her voice felt like it might break something fragile in the air. But she hummed. The tune came without thinking, like breath, like grief. I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger, as if the song had reached somewhere deeper than hearing. The creature lifted its head. Its mouth moved. Not words, not noise, but a soft rumble in its throat, low, uncertain, trying to follow her notes. Not an echo, a harmony, rough and trembling, but real. It wasn't mimicry. It was memory. June stopped breathing. The hum broke. Her hands closed tight in her lap. Across from her, the creature tilted its head. Eyes blinked slow, like something sacred had passed between them. Then it nestled back into the blanket, breath easing, chest rising, falling. The lantern flickered. Shadows stretched up the walls and vanished again. The barn sighed in the cold. And somewhere far off in the trees, the wind answered back with a sound that wasn't quite wind at all. She sat there until the bowl was empty, until the stars turned, until her knees ached and the chill worked its way into her bones. She sat like a guardian, like a witness, like someone who'd found a thread in the dark and didn't dare let go. That night, as she tucked the creature deeper into the folds of wool and stepped quietly back into her house, June didn't latch the door. She left it ajar, just an inch, the way she used to when her husband was still alive and might come back late from town. Not wide enough to be an invitation, but not closed either. On the porch, she left another bowl, this one filled with warm goat milk and a slice of fresh cornbread wrapped in flannel. And beside it, a sprig of cedar. She didn't know why. It just felt right. Inside, she lit one lamp and sat at her sewing table. The green yarn still waited on its spindle. The half-finished baby blanket lay where it had been for years, forgotten, unfinished. Her hand hovered above it. Then, slowly, she picked it up. Not for the child she never held, but maybe for the one curled in her barn now, with eyes that remembered things she couldn't name. The needle slipped through the fabric like it had been waiting. Outside, the wind changed again, softer this time, almost shy, and far off, so faint she might have imagined it, came a low, rhythmic knock. 3 times. She looked up, but the porch was empty. Still, she smiled. Not because she understood, but because something ancient had just brushed against her life and didn't ask to be explained. The wind chime swayed. Not from the breeze, but like someone had passed by without stepping, and the lantern on the porch flickered once, then settled. The bowl stayed full through the night. No footprints in the dirt, no noise from the barn. But June didn't sleep. She didn't need to. Something had shifted. Not in the world, in her. And by morning, when the mist curled low and the sky opened pale and wide, the bowl was empty, and so was the space beside the cedar sprig. By the time the first gray blush of dawn stretched over the hills, the air had turned heavy and still. Not the kind of stillness that comforts, but the kind that waits. The kind that seems to hold its breath before something breaks. Out by the barn, the animals felt it too. The goats huddled near the back of the enclosure, shifting their hooves anxiously, bumping into each other in uneasy silence. Chickens rustled in the coop with sudden bursts of nervous wing beats. their feathers flaring at sounds that hadn't yet come. June stepped onto the porch, mug of black coffee in one hand, the other gripping her shawl closed against the morning chill. Her boots met the old wood with a slow, deliberate rhythm. There'd been no knocks overnight, no stirred leaves, no guttural song echoing back through the trees. But that didn't mean nothing had changed. Something was different in the soil itself. She didn't see it at first. Not until she stepped off the porch, took a few slow steps toward the barn, and the dirt gave under her heel just a bit softer than usual. She paused, turned, looked down. There it was, half smeared by dew, but unmistakable. A print. Not goat, not deer, not bear. Toes long and splayed, heel deep. The kind of mark that didn't belong to anything she could name out loud. But that wasn't what made her breath catch. There wasn't just one. She crouched, coffee forgotten in the grass. In the red dirt that ringed the barn and bled into the tree line, dozens of prints crisscrossed each other. Some large, some small, some overlapping. A path, a pattern. Not a single creature, but a movement, a group. And not just passing through. They'd gathered here. Walked near the fence. Near the porch, near the spot she'd left the bowl. A trail of prints curved toward the edge of the woods, where a pile of river stones had sat untouched for years. Now those same stones had been rearranged, stacked in an arc, a crescent shape facing the house. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't natural. Kids from town wouldn't sneak all the way out here to play pagan games in the dark. Not without lights. Not without leaving beer cans or giggles behind. June stood slowly. Her knees ached. Not from the crouching, but from the weight of understanding settling into her bones. There'd been eyes watching the barn last night. Watching her. And not just watching, witnessing. She didn't say anything. Didn't whisper a prayer or curse or cry. She just turned back toward the porch, her breath clouding in the morning air. Her footsteps slow, deliberate. The goats bleated softly behind her as if sensing the tremble in her spine. Hobart Lane showed up just before noon, old Chevy sputtering to a stop by the gate. He didn't knock. Never had. Just hollered her name in that voice that carried through trees and roofs like it was trying to outrun silence. She met him halfway up the path. He looked at her face and stopped short. "You see it?" he asked. She nodded. He squinted toward the barn, hand resting on the butt of the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Could be bear. Could be worse." She didn't answer. "Want me to walk the perimeter?" She shook her head. "You got a gun?" Still no answer. He sighed, wiped at the back of his neck. "June, I ain't saying go shooting blind. I'm just saying, things are different up in them woods now. Been different since late summer. You hear them dogs last week? 2 counties over, gone missing same night." "I'm not worried about the dogs," she said quietly. He looked at her again. Really looked, but didn't push. "I'll keep my rifle close," she offered. Which wasn't quite a lie, but wasn't the truth either. He nodded. "You see anything don't make sense, you let me know." She didn't promise. When he left, the sound of the truck faded fast. Too fast, like the land had swallowed the noise. Back inside, June moved toward the table where the blanket still sat unfinished. The green thread was coiled neatly in the bowl beside it. The same thread she'd chosen for a child that never came. For months, years, she couldn't bear to look at it. Couldn't touch it without her fingers going cold. But now, she threaded the needle with calm hands. Smooth. Certain. She didn't hum this time. Just let the needle slip in and out, the rhythm steady as breath. Her thoughts didn't wander. They listened. Outside, the wind rustled the cedar branches along the fence line. The kind of sound that didn't ask to be noticed, but couldn't be ignored. When the sun fell behind the ridge, June stepped onto the porch with a bowl in her hands. Milk again. Warm. A few crumbles of cornbread on the edge. She didn't set it right away. Just stood there, watching the tree line as if it might shift or breathe or remember. Then she saw it. On the top step, nestled against the wood, lay something that hadn't been there that morning. A braid, not human, woven from dried grass and still green cedar, bent at one end like a loop. Tied into the knot was a fresh sprig, carefully chosen, placed with intention. She picked it up gently. It didn't fall apart. It didn't feel old. And for a long moment, she didn't move. Something had stood right where she was sleeping, close enough to leave a gift, not a warning, not a threat, a reply. She looked out over the land again, past the barn, past the stones, past the edges of everything she used to know. The red dirt held no new prints now. Rain had come just before dawn, gentle and warm, and washed the ground clean. But she didn't need prints. She could feel it in her chest. There were eyes on her still, watching, waiting, deciding. That night, she kept the lantern low and the door unlocked. Not wide open, but unlocked. Enough to be heard, enough to be trusted. And when she slipped the braid into the folds of the green blanket, tucked it in like a secret between threads, she understood something she hadn't known how to say out loud. Whatever this thing was, it didn't come for food. It didn't come for shelter. It came because she had answered. And now it was her turn to listen again. The chime didn't stir that night, but just before sleep took her, the house exhaled. The wood settled, and the wind rolled low through the pines with a sound like breath made of stone. And June, wrapped in shadows and stitches, dreamed not of loss, but of something walking the edges of her world with feet both ancient and soft. Under the thickening sky of late October, the air hung low and purple, like bruised silk draped across the timberline. Light filtered through the pines in ragged streaks, the kind that didn't fall but seemed to hover, trapped between branches and dusk. The wind had softened into breath, almost reverent, rustling needles with the same care one might use to lift a sheet from a sleeping child. There wasn't much sound, just the long exhale of the forest and the deep hush of something waiting. June stood on the porch holding the bundle in her arms, swaddled in the patched-together green blanket she hadn't touched in years. The creature rested inside it, lighter now, warmer, chest rising and falling with a rhythm that didn't match any animal she'd known. It had grown stronger, not by much, but enough to lift its head when she approached, enough to hum, barely, when she whispered old hymns under her breath. She hadn't tried to name it. Some things aren't meant to be named. But that morning, when its fingers curled around the cedar sprig she'd tucked near the hem, she knew it understood what was being offered. Not charity, not pity. Permission. Now, she moved with slow resolve down the creaking steps and out into the clearing. The grass was brittle beneath her boots. Frost had begun to nip the edges of everything green. The old swing swayed once on its own. 3 knots in the rope. She didn't look at it long. At the edge of the clearing, she spread out a wool sheet, a clean one stitched years ago, unused, and laid the creature at its center. It blinked at her, slow and black-eyed, breathing shallow but calm. She crouched beside it, smoothing the blanket's edge. Then she lifted her hand and tapped gently, 3 times, against the wooden post that framed the corner of the porch. The sound traveled further than it should have. Not loud, not sharp, but deep, like it had sunk into the soil. Then nothing. Only wind again, a flutter of wings in the pines. She stayed kneeling, didn't blink. Another moment passed. Then, clear and exact, came 3 knocks from the tree line. Not echo, not accident. Answer. She didn't rise, just lowered her eyes. Her hands stayed still on the blanket, fingers trembling now from something far deeper than cold. She waited, head bowed, as the forest held its breath with her. From the shadows came a sound. Not footsteps, not rustling, just presence. A weight of silence that pressed against her chest. Then she saw them, eyes. 1 pair, then 3. Then 5, scattered high among the branches, low near the brush, blinking in and out of view. never moving forward, not threatening, watching, not with hunger or fear, but with stillness that bore witness. Then one figure stepped out, not like the others. This one walked forward, not fast, but sure, with a gait that suggested age, strength, and something older than either. Its outline was massive, broader than any man, fur matted in places, clean in others. Across its left cheek stretched a scar that split the fur and puckered the skin beneath in a long, pale diagonal. It didn't growl, didn't snarl, just stopped where the light from the porch ended. June rose slowly, her knees stiff, the blanket cradled in her arms again. She didn't speak. The creature didn't advance. They looked at each other, separated by 10 feet and a canyon of understanding. She held the bundle just a little higher so the scarred figure could see. The child shifted in her arms and gave a low hum. Not a cry, not a warning. A note, almost like what it had mimicked before. The mother's eyes, because that's what June felt this was, shifted from her to the infant. Then back again, something passed between them. June took a single step forward. The figure didn't move. Another step. Then she stopped. She lowered the bundle slowly, back to the wool on the ground. The young one didn't resist. It looked up at her once, then toward the tree line. Then June stepped back. Only then did the matriarch move. Her steps were soft, deliberate, like she had learned long ago how to step without breaking branches. Her shoulders were massive beneath the mossy fur. Her hands, not paws, not claws, hung low, knuckled, but capable. She moved to where the infant lay, crouched low, and placed a hand on either side. Her fingers brushed the cedar tucked into the folds of the blanket. She paused. June didn't breathe. Then the matriarch looked up, straight into her eyes. What she saw there wasn't rage, wasn't suspicion. It was something else. Something that had survived cold winters and vanished kin. Something maternal. The wind shifted again, and from behind her, deeper in the pines, they came. Dozens of them, shadows, tall and silent, stepped from the trees in slow procession. They moved like ghosts with mass, real but other. Some were smaller, leaner, their fur darker. Others were enormous, their backs hunched, eyes glowing faint in the dusk. They didn't speak. They didn't growl. They stood in a kind of reverent formation, circling but not closing in. They came not to retrieve, but to bear witness. The matriarch leaned her head close to the infant's, her wide palm sheltering the child's brow. The baby pressed its face into her chest, then looked back once toward June. That look undid her. It wasn't goodbye. It was a vow. She didn't cry. Not then. Not when the matriarch rose. Not when the others began to back into the trees, carrying the child close to the heart of the forest. But as the last figure disappeared, tall and heavy-shouldered, dragging something like a limb or a long branch behind, it happened. The air began to tremble. Low, subsonic. Not a warning. A song. It started with one voice, low and resonant. Then another. Then dozens more. Not harmony. Not melody. But something like a chorus of breath and sorrow, rising and folding into itself. It didn't scare her. It cracked her open. It was grief. It was grace. It was a homecoming. She fell to her knees. Not from fear, but reverence. The song filled the clearing, pressed against the house, seeped into the cracks of the porch and windows like mist. It didn't linger. It didn't repeat. And then it stopped, all at once. Silence fell heavier than any storm, and then she saw it. Left behind on the wool blanket, a fresh braid, twisted tightly, woven with cedar, grass, and a single strand of green yarn. The same yarn she had used to finish the baby's blanket. She didn't touch it yet. She just sat there, alone in the purple dusk, listening to the place where the song had been. And in her chest, something shifted. Not broken, re-sewn. She rose slowly, cradled the braid with both hands, and walked back to the porch. The light was just beginning to fade from the lantern, casting long shadows across the steps. She placed the braid beside the bowl and didn't light another lamp. There would be more nights, but not like this one. A storm had been pacing the ridge since late afternoon, dragging its feet across the mountaintops like it couldn't decide if it wanted to stay or leave. By dusk, it had made up its mind. Thunder rolled in slow pulses, not violent yet, but close. The kind of storm that didn't come to tear through, but to sit heavy on your chest and listen. The sky went the color of ash water, the kind you find in the bottom of an old stove pan. June stood on her porch with the sleeves of her coat rolled back, hands busy tying up the last of the feed sacks. She should have gone inside, but something in her gut said, "Stay put." The wind snapped once, hard enough to rattle the screen door, and then came the sound again. Not the storm, not the trees. It came from her left, heavy boots on gravel, not trying to be quiet. Hobart Lane, same as always. With his long shadow and his old army coat that hadn't fit right since '74. He had the shotgun with him this time. Not slung. In hand. "You seen it again?" he asked before he was halfway up the steps. June didn't answer. He didn't wait. "Couple nights back, something walked right past my trailer. Didn't touch nothing. Didn't growl. Just moved like it owned the place. Lightning cracked. Not close, but enough to make the trees light up for half a second like bones under skin. I've been saying bear, but—" He looked at her, squinting. "This ain't bear, is it?" She tightened the knot on the feed bag. "What do you think it is?" "I think whatever's out there ain't new to these woods. Just new to us seeing it." He shifted the shotgun from one hand to the other. His knuckles were pale. "You still got that .22 your husband kept under the sink?" She didn't respond. "June, you got anything in that house that can make something bleed if it comes for you?" She stared past him, toward the edge of the clearing. The pines were whispering, not from wind, from movement. "You don't understand," she said. "What don't I understand?" His voice rose just a little. "That you're out here alone? That something's leaving gifts on your porch and singing in the damn trees like a church choir?" She stepped forward, stood between him and the tree line. "They're not here to hurt me." Hobart looked at her like she'd lost her damn mind. But he didn't raise the gun. Not yet. Then it happened. A sound came from the trees, low and rising, like a moan made of earth and water and time. Hobart dropped to one knee, shotgun raised, breath catching sharp in his throat. Another wave hit, this one deeper. The pressure of it made the porch boards creak. Hobart's free hand clutched his chest like his heart had missed a step. His ears rang. His eyes blinked hard against something that didn't shine but pressed. And June stepped forward. "You don't need that," she said, voice calm but ironed through. He was sweating now, face pale. But he didn't fire. Couldn't. From the trees they emerged. First, a shape, huge and unmoving, half shadow, half being. Then more, not charging, not even advancing, just showing themselves. Hobart gasped, not in fear, in disbelief. June turned, walked slowly toward the center of the yard, and knelt. From her coat pocket, she drew a sprig of cedar and a length of blue thread, the same thread from the unfinished blanket. Her fingers wrapped them together, knotting them into a loose braid. She placed it on the grass and stepped back. Then she carried out the bowl. Milk again, warm, cornbread broken in half. She set it down gently on the earth, not as an offering, but as an invitation. Behind her, Hobart was still frozen, breath rattling. And then the child stepped out, the one who'd slept in her barn, who'd taken warmth from her coat, food from her hand, and hum from her throat. It didn't run to her. It didn't run at all. It leaned against the edge of the clearing, eyes huge, body half behind a tall, wide trunk. But when it saw her, it made a sound. Not a call, not a growl. A note, familiar, shared. Then its eyes turned toward the others, and then toward her. The matriarch stepped forward. Closer this time. No snarl. No challenge. Her face bore the scar June had seen before, and behind it was something deeper than warning. Something that had chosen to hold back for generations and was now standing just outside the edge of a porch light. June didn't flinch. The child turned its head, leaned against June's legs for the briefest second, then lifted its gaze. The matriarch nodded. It was not a gesture meant for humans, but June understood it. Not just permission, not just approval, recognition. Then the sound changed again. From deep behind the tree line, the forest stirred. Not just a few more. Dozens, more than dozens. Shapes, tall and silent, stepped out from every angle. They didn't speak, didn't threaten. They moved with ceremony. The air went thick. The storm above them paused its pacing, as if to listen. June stood still, knees locked, throat dry. And then she saw something else. Among the shapes were children, not just the ones she'd kept warm. Others, older, younger, silent, staring. The matriarch raised her hand, not to signal, not to command, to acknowledge. And in that moment, June placed the cedar and thread token at the matriarch's feet. No words, no tears, just action. The matriarch reached down, picked it up, turned it slowly in her hand, and then tucked it behind her shoulder like it had belonged there all along. Hobart, behind her, was weeping. Quietly, he lowered the gun to the porch floor. They all stood like that for a long time, until the wind returned, and the figures turned, and one by one, they slipped back into the trees, all except the child, who looked back, who hesitated, who reached toward June once, then followed its kind. At the edge of the trees, just before the last shape vanished, the matriarch turned again, and for one long, unbroken breath, she and June stared across a chasm that no longer existed. Then she was gone, and the woods fell still again, but not empty, never empty. On the ground where the bowl had been, there remained a single, wet footprint. Not human, not beast, something else. And June sat back on the porch, Hobart beside her now, quiet and stripped of everything he'd thought he knew. No one spoke. The storm rolled over but didn't touch them. And somewhere out in the timber, something vast moved like it had always belonged. The morning broke without color. The sun had risen, but it hadn't pierced the low fog draped over the timberline or the creek hollow. Everything was gray and unmoving. Not even the chickens made noise. They just huddled together, eyes open, watching the woods like they knew something had changed again. June Carver stood on her porch in boots and a faded flannel, her hands gripping a warm mug of tea she wasn't drinking. The air was still damp from the night rain, heavy with the smell of bark and cold rock. She hadn't slept, not really. Just drifted between shallow dreams and old memories, while the braid of cedar and thread sat curled on her nightstand like a sleeping thing. She hadn't expected them to return. Not so soon, not again. But here they were. There was no sound of arrival, no breaking twigs or howls in the dark. Just the stillness, and then suddenly, shapes. First at the tree line, then at the creek bed, then along the ridge. They didn't move fast, didn't move like animals at all. They came with purpose, quiet, exact, like shadows that had remembered how to walk. The timberline was lined with them, some still, some swaying like the wind was inside them, not around them. Over 200, tall, broad, rigid in posture but not threatening, just present. Each silhouette holding its place, forming a crescent that arched around the clearing like a great lung drawn in but not yet exhaled. June's hands tightened around the mug. The steam kissed her chin, but she didn't blink. She wasn't afraid. Not in the way people talk about fear. What settled in her bones wasn't panic. It was reverence. Like standing in a church built of bark and silence. Only a dozen stepped closer. Their steps barely made a sound. Even the ones big enough to block out half the sky moved like water wearing down stone. They came through the grass and between the trees with the ease of something that belonged. They stopped 10 yards out and waited. She already knew what to do. She went back inside, moved through her kitchen like her feet had memorized the floor years ago, and returned carrying a bundle wrapped in the green blanket. It was smaller now, The child had grown stronger, but he'd gone quiet again since the last visitation. Not sad, just waiting. June descended the porch steps and crossed the yard, each stride slow, steady, deliberate. She could feel every eye in the clearing on her. Not hostile, not curious, just witnessing. She reached the center of the field and knelt on the damp earth, unwrapping the bundle with care. The child blinked slowly. His fingers curled into her wrist one last time, before relaxing. She laid him down on the grass and rose. They were close now. The matriarch stood at the front, scars still visible down her cheek, but her posture was calm. Her breath came slow and deep. Her eyes met June's without flinching. There was a pause, brief, but it stretched wide in the space between them. Then the matriarch stepped forward and did something June hadn't expected. She bowed. "Not low, just a tilt, just enough." Then she crouched, her massive frame folding gently as she reached for the child. June didn't move. The child didn't either. He raised his head and made a sound, a low note, not quite song, not quite speech, but it stirred something in the watchers. A wave of quiet rumbling echoed back from the line behind the matriarch, like breath held and then released. She placed one hand behind his back and the other on his chest, holding him close. And then, for a moment, she turned, not to go, but to face June again. It was in that stillness that the exchange happened. No words, no movement, but meaning passed through the air like scent, like warmth. Grief, recognition, permission. June stepped back, letting the moment settle. Then came the sound. Not from the matriarch, not from the child, but from the entire procession. A deep hum, layered and ancient, rose from the bodies standing across the field. It wasn't loud, it wasn't human, but it held a structure, a rhythm, like a funeral song with no beginning and no end. It wasn't mournful, it was acceptance, a welcoming back. The earth felt different underfoot. The air thickened, not with threat, but with presence. June's eyes burned, but she didn't cry. She stood still and listened, as if every piece of her knew it was supposed to. And then slowly the song faded, not all at once. Each voice dropped out like an ember cooling in ash, one by one, until the last note hovered alone, thin and perfect. Then silence. The matriarch stood. She looked down at the child once more, then turned her gaze toward June again, and placed something at her feet, a braid, this one thicker than before. Cedar, grass, and wound into it, unmistakably, a thread of green yarn. The same kind from the blanket. June didn't kneel. She didn't reach for it. She simply nodded. And with that, the matriarch lifted the child in her arms and turned back toward the woods. One by one, the others began to move. A quiet retreat. No rustling, no signal, just a shared knowing. They returned to the shadows, bodies melting back into the trees like fog returning to riverbeds. June stood alone in the clearing, the wind curling her hair around her shoulders. The braid lay at her feet. She picked it up carefully, fingers brushing over the tight weave. There was something new in it. Not just the yarn, a shape, a feeling, the way the knot curled around itself at the base. Not a warning, a symbol of bond, of return, of gratitude. She clutched it to her chest and closed her eyes. When she turned back toward the house, the sun had finally broken through the mist. Just a sliver. Just enough to catch the dew on the grass and make it glow like stars trapped on the ground. And for the first time in days, she smiled. Because the circle hadn't closed, it had only begun. By the time the leaves turned brittle and the air held that bitter copper scent of first frost, the clearing had settled into a new kind of quiet. Not the kind born of loneliness, but the kind you find in cathedrals just before dawn, where something sacred has already passed through, and nothing dares disturb the hush it left behind. June Carver knew how to read the wind, and this morning it carried no omen. Just silence, and the soft cluck of a hen scratching at wet straw. Everything was still standing. The barn, the coop, the porch swing that creaked in rhythm with the trees. No scorched earth, no torn fencing, no broken windows. And yet, something had shifted in the marrow of the land, like it had been touched by something older than memory, and it was still holding its breath. The braid still hung beside the door, tucked beneath the horseshoe nail where her late husband used to keep his cap. It hadn't unraveled. It hadn't gathered dust. And every time she looked at it, she swore the cedar still held its green. Out near the edge of the property, past the last fence post and the old river stone, the ground had changed too. Small piles of rocks, careful, intentional, began to appear along the brush line. Not just one, a row of them. Neatly placed, spaced the way boundary markers are, with a kind of precision that made her think it wasn't meant for her to cross, but for others not to. She didn't disturb them, didn't ask why. She just adjusted the feed schedule and watered the back rosemary bush like it was any other morning. People in town had started whispering. Of course they had. Someone had heard 3 deep knocks late at night, like wood hitting stone. Another claimed to see moving lights in the woods past midnight. A dog went missing on Deemer's Ridge, turned up 3 days later with no collar, but otherwise untouched. No bite marks, no scratches. Just silent eyes and a sudden refusal to sleep indoors. Deputy Nora Finch showed up that Tuesday afternoon, pulling up in a dust-crusted cruiser with a clipboard tucked under one arm. She knocked, polite but firm. June opened the door before the 3rd knock landed. "Ms. Carver," Nora said, eyes scanning the porch like she was searching for something she wasn't quite ready to find. "Mind if I ask you a couple questions?" June motioned for her to sit. Poured coffee, black. No cream, no sugar. "You been hearing anything unusual out here?" Nora asked, scanning the tree line. "People have been saying things, strange howling, chatter in the woods." June sipped her cup. "Woods have always had voices. Folks just forget how to listen." Nora frowned. "You haven't had any break-ins, nothing missing, no fences cut." "Nothing's been taken," June said, pausing. "But not everything's the same." Nora shifted in her seat. "You know, the thing is, the folks in Tangle Creek are rattled. It's been years since anybody claimed anything this far out, but they're saying it's back." June looked her in the eye, calm, measured. "What is?" Nora hesitated. "Whatever made those prints in '79, up by Miller's Bluff. Remember that?" June nodded. She remembered. Everyone did. But memories weren't facts. And sometimes the land buried truths so deep you couldn't tell the difference. "I'm just asking," Nora said gently, "if you've seen anything. Anything you can explain. Or can't." June looked out toward the pines. "Just the wind." Nora left a few minutes later. The kind of uneasy politeness that comes when you know someone's not lying, but also not giving you the truth you want. That night, June stood on her porch in her thick socks and long coat, the hem brushing the top step. In one hand, a shallow dish, cornbread broken into quarters. In the other, a bowl of water, not milk. She didn't know why the change felt necessary, only that it did. She placed both down with quiet hands and waited. No sound came, not even the familiar 3 knocks, but the air was full of tension, like something unseen was holding its position just beyond the reach of the lantern light. Still, the fence hadn't been crossed. The boundary held. It was a kind of peace she hadn't known existed. A silent covenant, drawn not with words but gestures, with food and cedar in careful distance. She turned to go inside. But when the morning came, the bowl was gone. Not the contents, the bowl itself. In its place lay a folded piece of deer hide. Tanned, clean, creased in 2 like a letter. There were no markings, no symbols. But June understood. This was thanks. This was memory. This was acknowledgement. She brought it inside, set it beside the braid, and didn't speak for the rest of the morning. Not to herself, not to the birds. Just moved in and out of her day like a woman tending sacred ground. That evening she walked the perimeter, not out of fear, out of respect. Every small pile of stones remained untouched. Not a single one had toppled, even with the wind. The hens were quieter now, not scared, just observant. The goats huddled near the fence in the late hours, facing the woods as if awaiting something. Or someone. But nothing came. Not really. Only a rhythm, a pulse. 3 soft knocks carried on the air, far, far off, like an echo bouncing off something no longer made of stone or wood. She didn't answer this time. Didn't need to. They hadn't crossed the boundary, and she wasn't calling them back. She stepped inside, closed the door, not locked, just closed, and ran her fingers once more over the deer hide. Then the braid. Then the smooth stone she'd found beneath her porch step, shaped like a tear. Another gift, maybe. Or just something the land had coughed up after decades of silence. She didn't know what would come next. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of waiting, full of watching, full of agreement. And though the wind howled louder that night, the boundary held. The night passed without footsteps, and yet, when she woke at dawn, there was the faint smell of cedar, stronger than before, as if someone had stood just at the line, breathing into the cold, before turning back toward the trees. And somewhere beyond the ridge, a bird called once, then went quiet. It was enough. The wind that night wasn't the kind that carried leaves or mist or scent. It carried grit. A dry, anxious wind that moved low to the ground and snapped at the grass like static. June had felt it coming since late afternoon, the way the sky shifted to that strange copper gray, like the color behind your eyelids when you press too hard. The goats had gone quiet. The chickens huddled without pecking. Even the crickets stopped mid-phrase. She'd meant to stay awake, meant to sit on the porch and listen, but her body had betrayed her. The long days, the heavy silences, the weight of watching had finally caught up. When she woke, it was to the distant sound of crackling. At first, she thought it was rain, the soft kind that tapped on leaves and rooftops, but the smell told her otherwise. Not petrichor, not water on dry wood. This was smoke, sharp, bitter, wild. She shot up, heart thudding before her legs even moved. Out the door, into the dark, barefoot on the cold porch, eyes straining against the shifting shadows. And there it was, the ridgeline beyond the east fence, glowing red. Not a wall of fire. Not yet. But the kind that crawled, that crept, that thought before it burned. She moved before thinking, pulled on her boots, threw her coat over her nightgown, grabbed the old hose from its hook by the barn and began to unwind it, dragging it toward the dry grass between the coop and the cedar grove. Her breath came in clouds. The wind shifted again, hotter now, carrying ash. Sparks lifted over the tree line like fireflies with teeth. Then it came, 3 sharp knocks, not from her porch, not from her barn, but from the trees, urgent, not a greeting, a warning. She froze, and then she saw it. At the edge of the clearing, a massive shape, backlit by the red shimmer beyond the pines, one arm raised, not high, not hostile, just enough to signal, come. Her mouth was dry. She didn't speak, just nodded once and followed. She didn't remember dropping the hose, didn't remember leaving the gate unlatched. Her feet moved on instinct, her body caught in something bigger than fear. The shape ahead of her moved fast but steady. She recognized the slope of the shoulders, the scar across the cheek, the way the massive hand brushed aside branches without breaking them. The matriarch. They didn't speak, just moved. The path curved around the trees, down into a shallow dip where the air grew thick with heat. The fire had jumped the ridge, split into 2 tongues, and was crawling toward the pasture with a slow, greedy rhythm. June turned to run back, but another figure stepped into view. Then another, and another. 6 of them, large, steady, alive in a way no animal had ever been in her presence. One stepped forward, knelt, and pressed both palms into the dirt. Another broke a green branch, still alive, still full of sap, and began swatting at the dry grass. And then June understood. She turned, sprinted back toward the house, dragging the hose again, twisting the spigot open until water sputtered out in bursts. She aimed low, soaking the fence line, the grass, the barn's north wall. Behind her, the sound of movement. Heavy steps, coordinated effort. Limbs breaking branches only to snuff flames with them. The fire didn't roar. It hissed, like it knew it wasn't welcome here. She saw one of them, taller than the rest, stand in front of the chicken coop, arms outstretched, blocking the wind. Embers flew around his silhouette like angry sparks, but none landed. Another moved behind the barn, pressing wet moss against the base of a timber already blackened. She moved faster, her breath ragged. Her eyes stung, but she didn't stop. Together they fought it, not with machines. With bodies, with breath, with water and green things and will. By the time the fire broke and turned, spinning toward the empty creek bed, June could hardly stand. Her coat was soaked through. Her boots were black with soot. Her hair clung to her forehead in wet, tangled strands. But the coop stood. The barn stood. The porch was untouched. She sank to her knees, heart pounding in her ears. Around her the shapes stood silent, watching the smoke drift off into the trees. Not one of them moved to leave. And then she saw it, laid gently on the porch rail, in the exact spot she always left her bowl. A new braid, still damp, woven tight with green cedar, fresh. She rose slowly, walked across the field with legs like ash, picked up the braid and held it to her chest. It was warm, and something was tucked inside. A piece of tin, small, bent, smoothed on the edges, but pressed into it. 3 marks, not carved, not scratched, stamped. 3 parallel lines. And in that moment, she understood. It wasn't just thanks. It was a crest, a mark, a sign that she was known, that her boundary was theirs too, that the land had made room for her name. The figures began to retreat, fading back toward the grove, shoulders still wide, breath still steady. The matriarch lingered longest, eyes locked with June's. And just before vanishing into shadow, she pressed a hand to her chest. Then she was gone. The fire never came back, and that night, when June washed the soot from her hands, she set the tin on the table beside the braid and didn't light a lamp. She didn't need to see it. She could feel it. The seal, the pact, the shared breath between the trees and the woman who listened. And outside, where the grass had burned dark and black, a single green sprig had already begun to rise. By the time winter came down full and proper, the land had grown quiet in a different way. Not empty, not dead, just settled. As if everything had agreed, without words, to hold still for a while. Even the wind moved slower, dragging through the cedar branches like it was tired too. The ground stayed frozen past noon. The chickens stopped laying. Frost hung from the goat's beard like cobwebs spun from silver thread. And June Carver, once just a woman with a porch and a barn, had changed too. You could see it in the way she moved through her mornings, slower now, but never aimless. You could hear it in how she listened, head tilted, shoulders soft, like every sound from the woods meant something. That morning, the fog was so thick it felt like the trees had stepped closer in the night. The light came late, crawling in through the windows like it wasn't sure it was welcome. June sat at her table, glasses low on her nose, her fingers tugging the last thread into place. The green blanket, finally done. Not the same one she'd stitched for the baby that never came. This one had grown new in the quiet months. It had seen nights and knocks and things she would never put into words. It was stitched not just with yarn, but with memory, with cedar, with silence. The kind of silence that changes people. She folded it slow. Not neat, not perfect, but the way you fold something for a child who might come back home, even if you're not sure when. Then she stepped outside, where the fog still pressed against the porch like a body at rest. She placed the blanket on the rocking chair. Just the corner. Just enough to say, "It's here if you need it." Behind her, the wood stove breathed low. The kettle hissed once and went quiet. Somewhere out near the grove, a branch cracked. But no one came. And that was fine. This wasn't about visits anymore. This was about holding space. For what had passed, for what might return. The porch boards were slick with frost, but she sat anyway, the blanket over her lap, the cedar braid still tucked inside the pocket of her coat. The mark on the tin had dulled some, but when the light hit just right, the 3 lines still shone clear. She touched it sometimes, not to remember, but to feel steady. A soft knock. She didn't move. Another. And one more. Not at the door, not from the trees. From far off, almost playful, like someone reminding her, "We're still here." She didn't call out. Didn't rise. Just looked toward the sound and nodded. Because it wasn't about fear anymore. Or wonder. It was about keeping the thread unbroken. By midday, the fog had lifted just enough to show the tree line again. The black shapes of bare limbs like fingers raised in benediction. Hobart came walking up the path a little after that, his hands empty for once. No shotgun, no scowl. Just his old wool coat and the quiet shuffle of someone who knew when to speak and when not to. He stopped at the foot of the porch, looked up, and smiled in that crooked, lopsided way that only showed when he wasn't trying. "Left the rifle at home," he said. "Didn't feel right bringing it today." June nodded. He sat beside her without asking. They didn't talk for a long time. Didn't need to. The kind of quiet they shared wasn't about what had been seen or done. It was about what they now understood, and what they promised to carry forward. The trees shifted once, just enough to let a sliver of light through. And somewhere in the distance, 3 knocks sounded again, not urgent, not ceremonial, just there, like a breath. June reached over and placed a second mug in Hobart's hands. He took it, sipped, then looked toward the trees with eyes that had seen war and loss and strange things in the dark, and now looked without question. "They ever knock for anybody else?" he asked. June smiled, small and deep. "No, they knock so I'll remember to keep listening." He nodded. They sat there until the sky dimmed again, until the trees turned to silhouettes and the porch lamp flickered on by itself. No one came from the forest that night, but something had already been left. At the edge of the garden, just beyond the last stepping stone, a new pile of small river stones had appeared. Not large, not loud, but arranged with care. Not a barrier, not a warning. A reminder. That grace, once given, is not always spoken of. It is just continued. And under that heavy sky, where the cold no longer bit but merely rested, June Carver leaned back in her chair and watched the edge of the world hold itself together in silence. There would be more winters, more fires, more things she wouldn't understand. But there was a blanket now, stitched full and warm, and on the porch, a cedar braid that still smelled like breath and earth and something older than language. And just before sleep took her, just as the cold settled around the porch like a tired dog curling up for the night, the knock came once more. 3 times, low, certain, and June didn't open her eyes. She just nodded, quiet as snowfall. Because some promises don't need answers, only keeping. Sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest truths. In the hush between wind and tree, in the stillness of an old porch at dawn, in the unspoken exchange between 2 very different lives, there's a kind of understanding that doesn't need words. Compassion doesn't always announce itself. It arrives gently, sometimes in the form of a warm bowl left out overnight, a cedar branch laid down in the dirt, or a boundary respected without demand. And when it does, it doesn't just change the one who receives it. It transforms the one who offers it too. We live in a world that often asks for noise, for proof, for certainty. But there are moments, rare and fleeting, when the most powerful things are the ones we can't explain. Trust given without question. kindness shown without reward, a shared gaze that bridges what logic never could. In those moments, we remember what it means to simply care for the living, for the wounded, for the unknown. Some truths aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be held. And when we choose to listen, not with our ears, but with our hearts, we open the door to a deeper kind of connection, one that honors silence, one that survives time, one that lives not in stories told, but in lives changed. If this story stayed with you, even just a little, thank you for letting it sit beside your thoughts tonight. Your presence here means more than you know. If you'd like to share how this story made you feel, or if something stirred in you while listening, I invite you to leave a comment. I read every single one. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, gentle, haunting, full of wonder, I hope you'll consider subscribing, following, or simply staying a while longer. There's always room on the porch.